Hi, my name is John and welcome to another edition of History Roadshow. There has been no queen since Catherine of Aragon who has made such a massive impact on the future history of England. Caroline would become the first of many German queens, and one that would be more than beneficial to the country's people and the crown. Caroline was apparently a lovely lady. She had married George Augustus, and he would go on to become George II of England, who was heir-elect of Hanover in 1705. Caroline was a knowledgeable lady and certainly had a few more brain cells upstairs than her husband. George was like many men we have talked about over time, a man full of self-importance with only one goal on his mind: to find his next conquest. Yet despite his infidelities, it said he remained deeply in love with his wife. But Caroline knew precisely where he was coming from and could quite easily manipulate him for her own ends. So sit back and relax as we take a look at Caroline of Ansbach. Please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell to select all notifications so you never miss any of our videos. And with that said, let's begin today's story. Upon their arrival in England, an amusing ode was written, and it read, "You may strut Dapper George, but it will be in vain. We know it's Queen Caroline, not you, that reign." And so begins this fascinating story of a new German monarchy. Caroline from the start had constant battles trying to keep her husband in line. He was literally promiscuous with a capital P, and even the son-father relationship was something that caused unrest. Caroline had 8 children in total, 5 boys and 3 girls. Caroline's father-in-law hated her husband so much, he demanded all the children be taken into his care. Of course, it proved fractious and ensured more significant quarrels later in life. In 1714, George I ruled and the House of Hanover moved to England. As always, emotions ran high. Caroline would start her reign as a princess by checking her purse for loose change and quickly deciding that her ladies-in-waiting should only be paid half of what they did get under that of Queen Anne. The ladies who had influenced court life since the Elizabethan times would now find that they would never again have any say on the matters in England. George I and his son George II, now the Prince of Wales, along with Caroline, Princess of Wales, were allowed to do all the entertaining upon settling into their new HQ. But when the king found out how popular this twosome was becoming, he had them banished from court in 1717. Caroline was not happy about this move. Her father-in-law had taken too many liberties, and enough was enough. For the next 3 years she quite openly ignored him, but she didn't rest and built a strong and amicable relationship with the politician Sir Robert Walpole. The two of them would eventually organise a new constitutional breakthrough, one that is still in existence today. It would be Walpole that somehow managed to instigate a coming together of father and son in 1720, but the reconciliation was not favourable to the prince. Yet Caroline knew she only had to bide her time for changes to be made. She had realised that England was a much better place for her children than Germany. Herself and Walpole aimed to get England out of the ongoing wars around Europe, instead concentrating on new distant shores and the potential empires of Asia. Things started to change upon the death of George I. Though Caroline's husband wanted Walpole dead too, she convinced him otherwise. Walpole continued as Prime Minister. It was a fresh start. Caroline, now Queen, would soon start to see her years of friendship with Walpole begin to pay off. Her plan was simple. She made the decisions with Walpole, and by telling her husband in a way, it was as though he had planned it all. This would quickly get the agreement she was looking to achieve. George was oblivious to the duet's political coups. He was far more interested in playing his games around the court, so getting him interested in anything other than adultery was quite time-consuming. But Caroline was doing fine. She would let him do what he liked, knowing her ways would always come to the fore. One quite sad tale involved a mistress of George, who he had been with for 20 years. Her name was Henrietta, and she was the unhappy wife to Charles Howard, a miserly heir to the Earl of Suffolk. Henrietta was never seen as a threat from Caroline, so much so the two became close friends. But Caroline would attempt to keep her away from both her husband and her actual husband, but George grew weary of this lady,
but still tried to get her to stay at court as a woman with whom he could still meet if the urge took him. But Henrietta had now had enough, and she told Caroline she would leave and even begged the Queen to release her. It was a heartbreaking choice for Caroline. George, who responded to the news, gave a most revealing comment. He said, "What the devil do you mean by trying to make an old, dull, deaf, peevish beast stay when I had such a good opportunity of getting rid of her?"
George returned to Hanover and, as per usual, became involved with yet another woman. Still, Caroline wasn't happy. He had been gone for a significant amount of time, mainly to be with his new amorous liaison, Amelia von Volmoden. Caroline sent word that his duties were to England and not some far-flung fling, although she consented to his relationship as she had done with all the others. Eventually George returned. He would now need his queen, far more than his German sweetheart.
Although Caroline did in her own way become English, she never forgot her Germanic roots. At her coronation in 1727, she would either rent or borrow jewels, with the mindset the more, the better. Nothing like a bit of bling to celebrate the big day. She was, however, considered a tight keeper of the purse strings and would work her staff hard for little payment. When it came to childbirth, she insisted on a German midwife, but her ladies started to get concerned after a few days. They asked her to invite an English doctor, but George had them all sent away. Caroline, unfortunately, lost her child.
Caroline was a stern parent. She would think nothing of smacking her children at court, in public, if they dared do anything wrong. But it was clear she loved her daughters far more than her sons. Although in 1734 she had doubts about the Princess Royal marrying the Prince of Orange. He wasn't what you'd call the most handsome prince and had a hunchback for good measure. But what could she do? They loved each other and Caroline welcomed him into the family.
Frederick, her eldest son, was the one she detested, along with George, her husband, who apparently took after his grandfather. When Caroline was dying, the hate was so bad that George kept her son away from her bed. Caroline said, "At least I shall take comfort in having my eyes eternally closed, and I shall never see that monster again." By now you might be thinking Caroline was not what you'd call a motherly type, and you'd be right. She probably tried to be affectionate and sympathetic to her children, but it just wasn't there. However, we cannot question her intellectual capacity. She loved politics, but also had a deep interest in religion and philosophy. She would read for hours, but this was yet another torment for George, who always had more exciting activities planned.
By 1733, Caroline had now started to wane. She became visibly weaker. By the time of her 50th birthday, she was suffering from rheumatism, but this would lead to a more debilitating illness. Her pain and discomfort were kept secret for some time, but by 1737 it was clear for all to see that Caroline was now very weak, to the point it was considered fatal. By November she was bedridden and little held out hope for her survival into the new year. George remained at her bedside along with her two unmarried daughters, Amelia and Caroline.
Caroline's mind remained clear to the end. In a tearful goodbye to her husband, she begged him to marry again when she was gone. With tears running down his cheeks, he responded by saying, "No, never. I shall have mistresses." And Caroline said, "Well, marriage has never stopped that." She died on Sunday, the 20th of November, at the age of 54. George lived on for a further 23 years, but he never remarried, putting all his efforts into enjoying his mistresses, which he always had done. Although Caroline's death was a blow to George, it would have a far more significant impact on Robert Walpole. He was eventually driven out of power in 1740, having been forced into a European war, the one thing that never happened when his good friend Caroline was alive.
The Queen and Walpole almost single-handedly ran Britain up until her death. Frederick, Caroline's son, never came to power. He died in 1751, and it would be his son who would be crowned George III. But no one should forget that the foundations that his grandmother had laid were now set in stone for the foreseeable future. There has long been a perception that Caroline and Walpole ruled over her husband. Numerous biographers credit her with assisting the House of Hanover's establishment in Britain, despite Jacobite opposition. It was entirely on the basis of facts that her gracious and dignified personality, lofty ideals and pure life contributed significantly to counteracting her husband and father-in-law's unpopularity and saving the early Georgian era from a political trapdoor. It was a time for new parliamentary democracy, constitutional monarchy was now coherent, and the press found new freedoms, industry gained momentum, and the arts flourished. While some believe her significance as being exaggerated, Caroline was undeniably one of the most influential consorts Britain has ever had.